Hello, everyone. This is Chris Martin. Welcome to another episode of Half Hour of Heterodoxy. I'm here today with Dr. Scott Lilienfeld. He's a professor of psychology at Emory University. He's a generalist when it comes to psychology, so he's done work in personality psychology, clinical psychology, social psychology, and a little work on neuroscience as well. He's the author of a popular textbook. He's also the author of 50 Great Myths of Popular Psychology, and also more recently of Brainwashed, the seductive allure of mindless neuroscience, which I believe came out 4 years ago.
Yeah, that's exactly right. 2013. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
So we're here to talk primarily about your recent article on microaggressions from about a year ago. It's published in a general psychology journal, and you've talked about it at conferences as well. Before we begin talking about your article, could you talk a little bit about what inspired you to write this article?
Sure. So, just for people who aren't that familiar with it, the microaggressions concept has gotten really hot over the last couple of years, especially in the U.S. I've learned that it's not quite as hot in some other countries like Australia, where I just spent about a month. They've heard of it, but it's not quite as hot there. But the idea here, which is not an unreasonable one in my view, is that there may be sort of unintentional, often unintentional snubs, slights, insults, and so on that stigmatized groups, particularly racial minorities, but other groups experience from time to time. And those kinds of experiences, according to the microaggression research program, as I call it, may have detrimental effects on mental health. So how did I get interested? I had not heard of it until 5 or 6 years ago. I think I may have heard of it just from in passing in literature, but I think I'd not really crossed my radar until 5 or 6 years ago, when I noticed it becoming quite big on a number of college campuses, including our campus at Emory University in Atlanta. A number of people were beginning to talk about it, and a number of people were beginning to raise concerns about microaggressions on campus, particularly toward racial minorities. I obviously became interested in that as well. And it particularly caught my attention, I think, about 3 years ago, when I began to hear that there were various training programs on campus that incorporated microaggressions, trying to get faculty members and students to recognize microaggressions, to be able to tell them when they were happening, and ostensibly to learn how to avoid them. Obviously, very well-intentioned, well-meaning programs. But as an outsider, I became interested in the question, are these programs well supported? Are they grounded in good research? And more broadly, is there a good research foundation to the microaggression research program? Is it really true that we understand what microaggressions are, that they have clear boundaries, that people can agree on what microaggressions are and aren't, and so on? So, out of curiosity, I just began to read literature, began to read some of the seminal articles. The first major one, just about a decade or so ago, by Daryl Wing Su. And to be honest with you, I didn't really come in with any particular preconceptions other than wondering what was up. I was sort of curious as to what the status of the research literature was. But I have to say, the more I read, the more interested I became, but also in some ways the more concerned I became, because the more I read, the more I became persuaded that there was something there to the concept. I think there actually still is some truth to the concept in there somewhere, but I also became increasingly convinced that people were not approaching it all that well, and that the concept was far too nebulous, far too fuzzy to afford real-world applications. And the more I read, the more persuaded I became of that. And then eventually, I'm forgetting exactly when, probably after about 4 or 5 months of reading the literature, reading pretty much everything that was out there at that time that was published in peer-reviewed journals, I said, I think I should write this up, because I think I need to get the word out that, yes, there's probably some truth here. In fact, I'm quite convinced there's some truth here. But by the same token, I'm also pretty convinced that people are rushing to apply these concepts prematurely in a way that could actually be harmful.
And before you wrote this article, had there been any, in the academic literature, had there been any criticism of the microaggression concept?
Good question. A little bit here and there. I would say there was some scattered criticism. I would say most of it, though, came from more informal sources, blogs, and so on, particularly of a conservative bent. Some of the
Mhm.
criticisms, I think, were reasonable. Others, I think, I don't even agree with necessarily. I think a lot of the criticisms that were were centered in more popular venues like blogs and various websites were more concerned about the over application of the concept and the concern that people might be uh, attributing microaggressions to fairly innocuous statements that just expressed various political views. I understand why it was coming primarily from the political right than the political left, because I think a lot of the things that are labeled as microaggressions, by no means all, but a lot of things that are labeled as microaggressions might be statements that some socially conservative people might hold. So, for example, if you look at Daryl Wing Su's list of microaggressions, some of them actually are things I would certainly agree are highly offensive too. I don't disagree with them on all of them, but there are others that include things like saying that America as a land of opportunity counts as a microaggression according to his list, which, by the way, is publicly distributed in many universities and colleges, saying that I believe America is or should be a melting pot also counts as a microaggression. Saying that when I look at you, saying to an African American, when I look at you, I really see you as a person. I don't see you as an African American primarily. I don't see race. All of those things are things that, at least according to some scholars, including some of the top scholars in the field, are listed as microaggressions. So it's not surprising that a lot of the criticisms of the concept came from more socially conservative venues.
Okay. So, with that background in mind, let's talk about your article. What was the outline of it? I think you broke it down into three specific criticisms, broadly.
Yeah, I had several different criticisms. I think the way I would sort of think about them is uh, one big criticism concerns the nature of the construct itself. Do we understand what it is? And one of the points I raised is that even though I think there's something there, right now it's so vague and so nebulous. It could, in principle, include almost anything that could offend almost anyone, and I think that's part of the problem. It lends itself to too much abuse, too much misunderstanding. That was one criticism. Another big criticism I had is that it seems to run counter to what we as psychologists have learned over the past few decades, which is that almost all of our reactions, that includes me, you, includes all of us, almost all of our reactions to the world are partly a function of the perceived, but they're also a function of the perceiver and the person who's interacting with the stimulus. So one of the criticisms I have of the microaggression concept and the way it's applied is that, yes, there's no question that sometimes people do emit insensitive statements. Some of them probably are racist and come from a racist place. Others, though, may be misinterpreted. Some of them may be innocuous. And one of the big concerns I have is that the literature, most of it, with a few exceptions, does not take into account the attitudinal or personality characteristics of the person doing the perceiving. And in particular, very few of the studies had tried to statistically control for a variable that psychologists call neuroticism or negative emotionality, which is the tendency to experience negative affects, negative emotions of many kinds, including a sense of victimization, a sense of being easily hurt, and so on. Some people, I should point out, have misinterpreted my statements, although I was very clear about it in the article, to say that meant I'm saying that microaggressions are entirely in the minds of the perceiver. I definitely don't believe that. What I am saying is that there may be a component of the reaction to microaggressions that in some individuals may reflect their personality traits, their attitudes, and so on. And interrelated criticism I had is that, in my view, a lot of the claims, again, they may be right and they may be wrong, but a lot of the claims about microaggressions being linked to negative mental health outcomes are premature. Again, I suspect they probably are in some cases, but we don't know. A lot of people were drawing strong causal conclusions from correlational evidence, and one of the things we have learned in psychology the hard way we teach our students is that correlation doesn't always imply causation, and merely because the same people who report lots of microaggressions tend to be the same people who report a lot of negative mental health outcomes does not necessarily mean that one causes the other. Although, again, I suspect my hunch is that there's going to turn out to be some causal link there. I also suspect it's probably not going to be quite as strong, quite as pronounced as some of the microaggression proponents have to say, but we will see.
Okay. Yeah, on the issue of what exactly counts as a microaggression and the lens through which you interpret it, I find that as an immigrant and as an Indian, sometimes people say to me, you speak English without an accent, or I don't hear this quite as much, but you speak English really well. And to some degree, I'm not sure quite how to take it. If there was definitely malicious intent, I think I would recognize it in their voice.
Mm-hmm.
And in
Absolutely.
general, there isn't.
Yeah,
So I tend to
absolutely.
interpret them as benign.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that. Um, by the way, unfortunately, I can't see you right now because I'm having a little glitch on my computer. But hopefully that'll. You can see me though? Okay,
Yeah, I can
right?
see you.
Okay. Um, so um, yeah, so I think that's actually a good example because there's a case where the person saying it may be somewhat insensitive, maybe even somewhat oblivious. Whether or not they actually mean harm is unclear, and whether or not it's reflecting racism or prejudice is also not clear. I don't think we really know in those kinds of cases. I think one of my concerns, and John Haidt has raised some of the same concerns, is that I think some, again, I want to say all, but some of I think the microaggression literature almost seems to um, as a default option, think the worst of people who deliver these statements. And I think that may be dangerous. Again, I suspect that some of the people emitting these statements are in fact prejudiced and racist. On the other hand, it might be better as a default option not to assume the worst and to first try to figure out what the person's intentions and meanings are before assuming prejudice when it may not always be there.
Right. So it does encourage, it kind of encourages you to draw a line between you and a person you see as your oppressor and think of yourself maybe as categorically victimized rather than maybe victimized in some situations.
Well, I think that's right, and I think too often in psychology, I think we tend to make what I have called the malevolent attribution error, which is to assume that a person's actions, and it's by no means unique to the microaggression literature. I think we do this in the world of politics too. That when we disagree with people, I think, far too often assume the person has ill intent, when in fact some of these things may just reflect different ways of seeing the world. And again, in some cases, as I argue, John Heitz argued the same thing. Probably a lot of what we call microaggressions are sort of inadvertent cultural slights that may reflect people's lack of knowledge about a culture, obliviousness, and so on. Again, others are probably entirely innocuous, and others, probably a subset of them, probably do reflect a genuine prejudice or racism. The lines between or among those different subtypes is probably pretty fuzzy and hard to distinguish.
Right. One of the things I think you've recommended is that people use the term unintentional slights rather
Hmm.
than the term microaggressions because the term aggression typically implies that people are intending to harm you. And if they're not, maybe the term unintentional slights is better.
Yeah, and I think probably not all, but probably a lot of what we call microaggressions probably are kind of inadvertent racial or cultural slights. I do worry that the term microaggressions was initially coined by Chester Pierce, who was a Harvard psychiatrist in the 1970 coined it, and then Daryl Wing-Sue kind of picked it up about uh, 20 years later, 25 years later. Um, the the worry I have is that that concept and the very term of aggression often implies ill intent, and I'm not sure it's going to be conducive to cultural understanding or racial understanding. I suspect that when you tell someone, "Oh, this is a microaggression," that is going to make both sides feel more defensive, and I think it may lead both people on both ends of the conversation to clam up and not listen to each other.
Right. So you close your article with some recommendations. Could you talk a bit about those?
Sure. Yeah, I list a lot of them are research oriented, so I think I listed a good 17 different recommendations for how to improve the quality of research. On the research front, I think there are a number of suggestions I have. One of them, I think, is to do a better job of studying the people who are emitting microaggressions, and there are now, I think, a couple of papers that are doing that, and I just saw one that came out. I have not had a close chance to read it, but one that just came out that does, in fact, suggest some potential link between microaggressions and the people emitting them and overt racism. The correlations were, I think, moderate, which is about what I would predict, actually. So I think too much literature has relied on respondents' self-reports of both microaggressions and their own mental health, which I think may introduce a kind of confound due to personality traits and other kinds of psychological characteristics. So looking more closely at the people who actually emit these microaggressions and their characteristics, I think, is very important. I think looking at different reporters is also important. Looking at both self and observers, I think, is another big suggestion I have. I think in terms of real world uh, implications, I argue that microaggression training programs, in my view, again, well-intentioned, well-meaning, they may do some help, but I worry they may be premature. I think that at the very least we have to approach them very carefully because there's an assumption out there that doing something is always better than doing nothing when it comes to reducing prejudice. I understand that assumption, but I think it may be misguided. We've learned the hard way in the history of social science that sometimes if we prematurely introduce a social intervention before we really understand the phenomena at hand, we may end up doing more harm than good. And I worry that by sensitizing people too much on college campuses to microaggressions, we might actually end up producing backfire effects. Again, it may make both sides feel defensive. People may be on the lookout for microaggressions, and in some cases, yes, in some cases it might allow them to detect microaggressions that were subtle, but in other cases it may lead them to make false positive identifications of things that in fact are not microaggressive, and that might make them feel defensive because they may be on the lookout for any potential hint of something that could be problematic, and then it also might make people who are on the other side, the receiving end of that, feel that they have to walk on eggshells and watch everything they say. So I think both of those could be problematic.
Right. I think one thing that might be helpful is to do a controlled study. If you actually think of microaggressions training as an intervention, someone could potentially have an experimental group of participants who undergo that, and control group that doesn't. Although that would be difficult to measure the consequences because the consequences happen in real life.
That's right.
So
But
you go ahead.
yeah, but I agree with you. I think doing a randomized control trial, I think it's not easy, but I think it could be done. And I think we need a lot more evidence to first show that these kinds of programs are helpful. I think a lot of university college administrators, including those at my own campus, have sort of rushed ahead to apply these programs with the assumption that we've got a problem here, which I agree with. There clearly is racial prejudice on campuses. There's certainly we've not extinguished it entirely. There are certainly pockets of prejudice on campuses. So we've got a problem. We have to try to fix it. The problem is I'm not sure that that's always going to be the best approach. And we know there's at least some research, admittedly it's laboratory research, but we know at least there's some research suggesting that diversity training programs, if they are done in a way that's perceived as coercive or over the top, ham-fisted, there's some suggestion that those programs might actually paradoxically increase prejudice in the long run. So we have to be careful not to do more harm than good. I wrote an article in 2007 that was actually more on psychological treatments rather than training programs. But one of the conclusions I had in this article is that there seems to be a subset, I think luckily it's a minority, but there seems to be a subset of psychological treatments, psychotherapies, that actually seem to have backfire effects. And one lesson of that, and Tim Wilson at the University of Virginia has made the same point, is that we cannot necessarily trust face validity, that is, whether an intervention would seem to work, would seem plausible on its face to work. We can't always trust those intuitions to tell us whether or not an intervention works. We have to actually do the hard work of doing the study. And there's no clear evidence about which treatments are likely to backfire, although I would argue there's some suggestion that if treatments are perceived as too coercive, if people feel that they're being told what to do in a way that's not collaborative, I think there is some suggestion that those kinds of treatments can, in some cases, be harmful. And I worry a bit that may be the case with microaggression training programs too, although at this point, we really just don't know.
Yeah, I know there have been some cases of professors, quite kind of rare cases, but some cases of professors feeling like racial sensitivity training at their campus has been overbearing.
Yeah.
There was one case, I believe, at Duke Divinity School recently. But getting back to the article, you've presented this now at conferences. I was at one of those presentations back in January at San Antonio. What kind of reactions have you got from the psychologists at these conferences?
I've actually only presented at that one conference, but I've certainly gotten emails from colleagues around the country and responses on blogs and so on. I have to say I've gotten less hate mail than I expected. I expected to get a lot of angry mail, a lot of hate mail. I got less than I expected. I've certainly got criticisms here and there, which I think is healthy. I think my feeling is if I'm going to put myself out there and criticize other people's research, they have plenty of right to criticize me in return. But I really haven't gotten any extremely negative responses. I think some of the responses have been thoughtful. I think some people feel that I have underestimated the severity of microaggressions or their impact and so on. And again, my attitude there is I'm open to it. I think again, as I argue in the article, I would be very surprised if what are currently called microaggressions don't have some negative impact or some negative effect on mental health. So again, my attitude is I'm willing to look at those kinds of data. There have been a couple of critiques that I'm not sure they've been published yet, but they've been floating around the literature. One interesting critique, which I'm not sure has yet been published, is that I seem to have underestimated the historical context of microaggressions. I think that's a reasonable criticism, that a lot of these statements that may seem innocuous to me may reflect code language and may have a different meaning to people in minority groups. I think that's a reasonable point. I actually agree with that. I think my only response to that is I don't think that's inconsistent with my point of view. Again, I think that microaggressions are multiply determined. I think some of them do reflect prejudice, some of them subtle forms of prejudice, and some of them I think probably have a very different impact for minority than majority individuals, and I think that's something worth keeping in mind. So I'm happy to accept that amendment. I think that's a reasonable criticism. I think some other criticisms were maybe somewhat less helpful. I think I occasionally have gotten this thing that people from majority groups don't have a right to criticize this literature, or that a few people have gone so far as to say it's racist to criticize the microaggression literature, or that one person I read recently said that my article and ones like it are themselves microaggressions and so on. I don't think that's too helpful. I think that's not a good sign when people have to resort to that kind of argument. And maybe just my own training as a clinical psychologist, but it reminds me a little bit of the old days of psychoanalysis, where psychoanalysts would say, if you disagree with us, therefore you must be resisting unconsciously or something. You must have problems if you're doing that, and that didn't work very well. I think that in general, people on both sides, I should welcome criticism, and I think people who support the microaggression research program should welcome criticism. I think we all benefit from more criticism, and it should be done in a way that I think is respectful and that doesn't call into question people's motives. And as I've told people, if people feel I'm being disrespectful, I don't think I have, but if anyone feels that way, I'm open to that too. Someone should tell me that. But I think my own take is that both sides, I think, would benefit from greater receptivity to criticism. I think questioning people's conclusions, and some people who question mine, I think is fine and healthy and constructive. I think questioning people's motives and trying to shut down conversation by saying any criticism of this concept must itself reflect prejudice or racism, I don't think that's likely to be helpful, and I suspect in many cases it's also not going to be true. So again, there's been a range of criticism, but I have to say, in general, I've been pretty pleased by it. I think most of the psychological community, even those people who have not always agreed with me, have in general responded constructively, and I'm pleased to see some people are now doing studies to try to address some of these criticisms. Again, I'm seeing some people, probably they're trying to rebut some of what I said, but that's part of science too. Some people, I think, are trying to do more to study the people who admit these ostensible microaggressions and study their characteristics to see whether or not they're actually prejudiced or racist. That I think is important, and I'm glad to see that. I'm actually collaborating with a couple of colleagues at Swinburne University in Australia who read my article and were intrigued by it. So we're actually doing some work on microaggressions that is starting now. We're trying to actually randomly assign some people to receive microaggressions and other people not to receive them, and then looking at their effects on mental health.
Hmm.
Um, so so I think that'll be quite interesting as well. So again, I think these have all been helpful, constructive, virtually all of them helpful, constructive discussions, and again, my view is that the constructive criticism is the lifeblood of science.
I'm glad to hear that there's some interesting work going on now as a result of that article. One of the things that struck me as at SBSB was your particular presentation was part of a set of presentations that were assumed to be politically controversial, and the session overall went much better than I expected. There were
Me
definitely
too.
no violent protesters, no protesters. The questions were some were confrontational, but they were all civil and interesting scientific questions.
Absolutely, and yeah, I never mind tough questions. I've gotten a thick skin over the years as a
That's good.
presenter, and I've learned so long as the question is phrased in a respectful way, I think that's reasonable. And frankly, I think as presenters, we have a responsibility to be respectful. Also, doesn't mean we can't be critical or tough. We should be when it needs to be. But I think because we're dealing with controversial issues, I think it's also incumbent on us to do it in a way that communicates respect and doesn't go beyond the data on our end. We don't want to make the same mistake that the people we're criticizing are making, which is to make extravagant claims that go beyond the evidence.
Right. Well, one other topic I wanted to talk about, I know you've got a paper in the works now. It's about the Goldwater Rule. Can you talk a bit about what the rule is and what you're writing
Yeah,
about?
yeah, that one. This one, I thought I'd got myself out of controversy. I may have entered an even bigger controversy. So it's actually a paper that is in press now at the same journal in which the microaggressions paper was published, which is Perspectives on Psychological Science. It's a journal of the Association for Psychological Science. So the Goldwater Rule, it's kind of funny. It got a lot of attention back in the 60s, early 70s, and it kind of disappeared. And for reasons I'll explain momentarily, it's made discussion of it's made a big comeback. So in 1964, Barry Goldwater was running against Lyndon Baines Johnson for president, and it was a very contentious election. Goldwater, senator from Arizona, was conservative. Johnson, who had just assumed the presidency after the assassination of JFK, was the Democrat, and Goldwater was considered to be far too conservative for most people. He was actually more of a libertarian conservative, but he was quite far right in terms of defense policy and so on. And a lot of liberals didn't like him. So a magazine which is now defunct called Fact, F-A-C-T, sent a survey to a large number of psychiatrists asking them to comment on Goldwater's mental health, and over 1,000 responded, and many of them wrote very, I think we'd now agree are very insulting, incendiary comments about Goldwater, all of which got published in this issue of Fact. Some people declined to respond, some of the psychiatrists. Others said, I don't agree with his politics, but he doesn't seem mentally disturbed to me. But many of the responses referred to him in very derogatory terms, some calling him schizophrenic or bipolar or paranoid or disturbed. Others made psychoanalytic conjectures about his relationship with his mother, things like that. So it received a lot of criticism, and even some people who disliked Goldwater intensely thought it was over the top and inappropriate for psychiatrists to be doing that. So Goldwater turned out sued and was awarded some money. Actually brought the case to the Supreme Court ultimately. But about a decade later, a little less than a decade later, the American Psychiatric Association, in responding to the criticism and largely embarrassment over this Fact magazine case, passed a rule. It colloquially became known as the Goldwater Rule, which more or less says, I'm going to simplify things here a little bit, but more or less says that psychiatrists should not, and it was actually it was beyond a guideline, but as a formal rule, psychiatrists are banned, prohibited from making diagnostic statements about public figures, and that's been the state of the Goldwater Rule. The exact boundaries have been kind of blurry, but if anything, the Goldwater Rule seems to have gotten broader of late, and the American Psychiatric Association now seems to say that psychiatrists, again, it only applies to psychiatrists, not psychologists, psychiatrists should not make any comments about a public figure they have not directly examined. So the one exception to this, although it would be very rare for this to happen, would be if a psychiatrist somehow examined a public figure like a presidential candidate or a president or politician, and then in turn got permission to release that diagnostic information. Again, that would be extremely unusual, but that would be the one exception in which someone could do that. So the Goldwater Rule, without getting too political, has gotten a lot of attention over the last year and a half, 2 years, in the wake of the candidacy and now presidency of Donald Trump, with a lot of people arguing that Trump has a personality disorder or some other psychological condition that either makes him unfit for office or raises questions about his suitability for office. So the article we wrote looks at the empirical foundations behind the Goldwater Rule. The assumption behind the Goldwater Rule, in short, is what we call the direct interview assumption, the assumption that somehow you glean a lot more information from a direct interview with a politician or other public figure than you would by watching that person, and that's why you need a direct interview with a person. And we argue that may have been true in 1964 when Goldwater was running for president, but we argue it's almost certainly not true in 2017, where we live in a world of social media. There are hundreds and thousands of hours of Trump and Clinton and Sanders and everybody else. We have access to their Twitter, Facebook, videos, interviews, diaries, and so on. And we basically review literature showing that although it's obviously all things be equal, it's good to be able to interview the person directly. There's now plentiful evidence that one can often make fairly valid diagnoses from afar if you have adequate enough information. So we argue the Goldwater Rule is premised on really outdated scientific assumptions that no longer hold. That's not to say that we argue that psychiatrists or psychologists should run around willy-nilly making slap diagnostic judgments about political figures. We argue there probably is it's probably better to keep your mouth shut and not to say anything, because there certainly is a risk of harm to public figures. Can give psychology and psychiatry a bad reputation, and we argue in general discretion is the better part of valor. But we also argue that the privacy that should be afforded public figures, which I think is reasonable, has to be balanced against public welfare. And if there are cases in which a politician may have a psychiatric disorder that could actually be relevant to public welfare, and at least some voters, again, most voters might not care, but at least a certain subset of voters might want to know about that, we argue that has to be balanced against the individual's right to privacy. So we argue the Goldwater Rule probably is now outdated and probably should not be upheld.
Okay. Well, it looks like we've got to wrap up now, but thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. It was fun.
All right. Well, take care.
Okay. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
All right.